Hey everyone, this is Dr. Chellam, your host for Women Wired for Wellness. So this particular podcast, I have to give you a little bit of a primer. My conversation is with Dr. Cammy Benton, who's a colleague and friend. And really I wanted to have this conversation because we're in the midst of a pandemic and a lot of talk about vaccine. Oh, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I will get vaccinated. But Dr. Benton has done a lot of work and research in this area. And she runs a direct primary care as a family practitioner. This is what she loves to do, and she's been running this direct primary care. And she does have a view on vaccines. Now, I will tell you my personal view. I feel vaccines are the greatest discovery, like everybody else, just like antibiotics are. They save a lot of lives. However, some things have changed in the last few decades. We have changed as human beings. We've evolved. We're exposed to a lot more substances that we're not exposed to. Even me as a child, I wasn't exposed to a lot of these chemicals. So we have evolved as human beings. Our earth has changed because of how we're utilizing earth. And so our reaction to vaccines have actually changed. However, I've never seen a topic that's more labile, volatile. I've never seen physicians being so livid and angry with each other and with patients who will not see what they see in vaccines. So if I believe vaccines are a very miraculous discovery, and if there's a patient who believes they're afraid and they will never have it, this is the only time I've seen a physician break a Hippocratic oath and discharge a patient from their practice. Think about it. If I had a patient, and I did have a patient, I remember as an intern, there was this young person, a young guy who would smoke cocaine and have a heart attack. And he would come to the emergency room with this crushing chest pain, would immediately take him to the cath lab. He would get a stent. We'll educate him that it came from the cocaine. He's too young. He doesn't have cardiovascular disease. He would go out and right back next week, he was back in the ER with this crushing chest pain after using cocaine. We put another stent, and he did not have insurance, so all his stents were done, provided by you and me. Now, I don't think at any point any of the doctors, the cardiologists, the internist, me as an intern, would ever think about telling the patient, we're not going to treat you because you're using drugs. Never happens. Never will happen. However, you as a mother refuse vaccines for your child because you have a certain fear, you will be discharged from a practice. Is that even right? Is that even something that's acceptable? Apparently it is. And why are we where we are? That's the conversation I wanted to have. So if you as a patient listen to it, share it with someone else who's concerned about vaccines. And if you're as a physician, have an open mind and have those very difficult conversations with your patients. Patients are afraid because of what they hear. We are living in a world of information overload. But if somebody has a fear, our job as physicians is to make sure you put in your 100% or 110% effort to help people understand, number one, what the science shows. Number two, our job as a physician is to actually hear our patients and listen to them. When there is a behavior, there is always a feeling behind that behavior. And if that feeling is one of fear, it's because there's a lack of education. Or it could be because of an experience. And it's our job as physicians to really listen to that. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Benton, and it may look like, it's starting like without any specific intro, but let me tell you this. We were having this conversation. I found it so powerful. I just pushed the record button and we just straight went into the podcast. So don't think that I forgot to include the first part of the podcast. It's just, it looks like it's an incomplete one, but it's perfectly complete. Listen to it, share it, like it, download it, and please make sure to write a review for us. Without any further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. Cammy Benton.
All think they're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I am right. And if because I did well on the Whole30 diet, then you have to do the Whole30 diet. Everyone else must do well on the Whole30 diet. And I remember I met a doctor. She is clearly CAFA. She's like, no, you don't need any fat in your diet. You don't need any meat products. And she's clearly this beautiful CAFA, like beautiful, clear skin. And I'm like, wow, you're like beautiful. If I did low fat, I'd be all wrinkled and like arthritic, you know?
Sure.
And she was like, no. I was like, no, we all have different needs, you know, like we just got to meet in the middle. And I think that's politics, race, you know, vaccines, medicine, coronavirus.
Yep. We have to, I think we all have to come to the table saying that we don't know enough. No one knows enough. I mean, you could have done all the research, and in fact, you're so close to the tree that you're missing the forest when you're into this. And that's why when I listen to Dr. Paul Hoffett, and then I listen to somebody else who has a different view of it, I see where they're coming from, but it does not mean that they are the undisputable experts in it. They didn't get into the cell. They don't get into every human being to know what's going on. Everybody is different. So let's get started with your story. I mean, I really love to listen to. Start off with, did you always want to go into medicine?
I did not know, because I grew up in a pretty, for the United States, I grew up in a pretty poor area, and my parents were relatively uneducated, awesome, but uneducated. And so I didn't really think about medicine at all, but I did read books about kids with cancer and scoliosis and diabetes from the book fairs. And the funny thing I would always say when I was older, people said, well, why don't you go to med school? And I'm like, oh, that's for rich white kids, as if I weren't white. But for some reason I had this, that's all pop out of my mouth. That's for rich white kids, not for country people like me, you know? And then I decided my junior year of medical school, before medical school, junior year of college, and I was just prayed, dear God, like I didn't love the major I was in. I couldn't make myself write a letter. I was like, I just couldn't commit to it. I'm a pretty passionate person. I just prayed, and it kind of came to me. And so by the grace of God, I managed to get into med school last minute, and and I did everything opposite of what I was supposed to do, and I still got in. So it was great.
What do you mean by everything opposite of what you should do?
It's just like the funny, like, they say you've got to wear a black or gray suit, pull your hair back. And I wore a faux fur jacket is green and bright red lipstick, and my hair curled down and high heels. And when they said, because I went to East Carolina, and they're like, well, that was the sort of the thing, is to create primary care doctors for the eastern part of the state. And so they're like, well, are you going to, stay here and become a famous doctor? I'm like, oh no. I was like, I'm heading out of here, never coming back. It's like, this place is too hot, flat, and sandy for me. Or another thing is they're like, well, what are you going to do if you don't get in? I was like, well, clearly I need to study more. They're like, well, what if you never get into med school? I was like, I guess I'll be a waitress. I don't know. It's like, what else would I do besides medicine? Like, I mean, I gave them all the wrong answers, but I got in right away. I think because they saw I was just like, well, this is what I'm going to do. Like, what else would I do? This is, why would I be anything else? So I gave all the wrong answers that turned out to be apparently the right answers that got me in.
Very nice. And what was your journey through medical school? Did you have an idea what you wanted to do?
I'm a dabbler by nature, but I came down to family medicine because I just couldn't give up anybody. I like kids, I like my elderly people, I like end-of-life care, really liked end-of-life care a lot. I almost did hematology oncology. I really like the genetics of the hematology part, and but I really love the care of death and dying, the transition of life. And so I almost did that, but then, like I said, I just couldn't get rid of the rest of it. So I just stopped with family medicine, and because I can do everything. It's fun.
Yeah, family medicine is always fun. I would have never done family medicine because I could not handle kids. Crying kids, I would cry louder than them. So that was not something I was going to do, pediatrics or family medicine.
I love my home visits. I do baby home visits and home visits for my elderly, the homebound people. Like, that just warms. Honestly, primary care warms my heart. Like, even though I do functional medicine, my heart is driven by good primary care, preventative medicine.
It's very difficult actually to do that in today's day and age with So much of information. So tell me your journey from becoming a family medicine. Why did you even venture out to do functional medicine or get board certified in integrative holistic? What was that? What was that drive there?
There are two different sets. One was I remembered in residency starting to question things because I would have patients, doing Google searches, Dr. Google, and they were saying, well, this is wrong with me. And they'd list all these different things that, like, wow, I see it. I can see your rashes. I can see your suffering. I can see all these connections. And then I'll go tell my attending and they're like, oh, Dr. Google, they just need an antidepressant. And this is at, I think, a really good university that I trained at and really good doctors that have heart. But that was just sort of the mindset is that I think they belittled the suffering of patients. I'd have to go back to that patient and say, they don't know how to help you and I don't know how to help you either. And I just could not bear the thought. I'd see their desperation in their eyes and me telling them that was all in their head. It just did not sit right with me. It just didn't feel good to me. And I was like, there's got to be a better answer. And so, I remember driving when I was done with residency working and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just giving a pill for this disease and it's causing this side effects. I'm giving a pill for that side effect and giving a pill for is there nothing better than this? And then I met a homeopathic doctor, was giving a talk somewhere. I'm like, wow, there's a whole other field of medicine I'd never even heard of. And but it was too much for me to abandon what I was doing. It too much money. So then when my kids started having vaccine reactions, that I didn't even recognize at first. I didn't recognize that's what it was. They were having all these weird things happen, all three sets of them. And I ended up having to mix up homeopathy and the functional medicine to be able to try to repair their health. And I was like, why are my kids having such health issues when I'm trying to give them the best food? I try to breastfeed. I try to do everything right. And I was still having all these issues with my kids. And I felt like a failure as a mother and as a doctor. It's like, what am I doing wrong? And that's when I discovered that point is the American Board of Integrative and Holistic Medicine. Yeah. And I literally cried the first day of the conference. I mean, I was like, there's a whole sea of other doctors out there. I'm like, I thought I was all alone in the world thinking that something wasn't right. And it just like the angels were singing. But even then it was such a broad, I felt like it was the famous medicine of holistic medicine. It was just such a broad spectrum of options. I'm like, well, how can I do something that's practical? And that's where I discovered functional medicine. And same thing, I went to the first day and I'm like, gosh, this makes so much more sense. I cried because it's really based on what we had learned in the first 2 years of medical school, all the biochemistry, pathophysiology, the genetics, and the embryology, all those things that we learned in first years of medical school that they said to us, don't worry, you just have to memorize this, then you can forget it all and get to the fun stuff when you get to rotations, right? Yeah. I remember hearing that a lot of times. And then as soon as I discovered functional medicine, I'm like, this is the first 2 years of medical school. This is what we're supposed to be learning as the connection of the human body to these different organ systems. We aren't just a heart or just a kidney, right? And it was just this aha moment, and then of course, learning that and helping my kids. And then when I finally realized, oh my gosh, they're actually having vaccine reactions when my child had the oldest, and I can go into more detail if you want, but my oldest had more serious reactions at her 5-year vaccines after I had already kind of started being a little suspicious, I think she's having issues. And then I had to undo everything.
So let's go delve a little deeper into that. So when you had your kids, were you in medical school or were you already a practicing physician?
I was already a practicing physician for several years.
Oh,
so okay. I finished residency in 2004 and I had my first child in 2008. So okay. For 4 years.
Up to 4 years. And I know we all, in medical school, we learn about vaccines being such an important preventive measure. It's truly a preventive measure. You can prevent somebody from getting a disabling and sometimes fatal viral infection or a bacterial infection. So tell me your journey as a mother and as a physician, because having a journey as a mother, I find as a physician is completely different. We tend to downplay things till they get out of hand because we're physicians. And that's something I've noticed. And I know there are cartoons out there where you see the child brings a broken leg and I think it's a bird, and the physician mom says, just go tape it back together, right? It's almost like we don't take too many things seriously till something happens. So tell me your journey as a mother and as a physician as far as your kids went in terms of vaccination, because I think that's very important, because that may have been a defining moment in how your current passion about medical freedom and not wanting mandates, and you come from that. And this is not by any means, for anybody listening, this is not an anti-vax conversation. No. It is really understanding what can happen and how can you deal with this. What are the different ways you can deal with? So let's begin from don't leave out any details.
Okay, well, I kind of had to take a step back, because what's important in like functional medicine is that we look at genes, like what you're kind of born with, but
you just froze, Cammy.
Oh,
I missed that part. Go ahead.
Okay, I said, it says my internet connection's unstable. Right, am I still freezing?
No, you're fine.
Okay.
No, right now I can see you.
All right, so I think I gotta take a step back, because like you said, it's different as a mother versus as a physician, because even there's things that you can have happen to you that you still kind of blow off.
Yeah.
And even as a because you're like, because it's part of the cognitive dissonance. It's like what you're taught is one thing, and you're taught really to not believe what you see. Kind of like those patients when I was in residency. Yeah. Yes, they might have rashes underneath their armpits and in their groin and yeast infections and thrush, but they cannot possibly have too much yeast.
Yeah, because they're not immunocompromised. They don't have any other conditions, so right. They don't have it. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
So we can't believe it. We cannot believe it. So, and I was just like anyone else. I mean, I had no predisposition to thinking anything against vaccines at all. It's safe and effective. Science is settled. The greatest miracle of the 20th century. It's great stuff. Mm-hmm. But, in retrospect, when I had joined the military even, it's kind of another long story, but so I got vaccines there, the tetanus vaccine for college. And within a year, I had an autoimmune thyroid condition. But I didn't connect it because it was like a year or so later. And then when I had the hepatitis B series for medical school, I ended up with rosacea, red skin condition, and the episcleritis. So it's an eye condition at the same time. Well, then I had that. And then when I had the Tdap vaccine, thinking I was got to get this because I'm starting to have children, I ended up with 5 months of bronchitis. And ever since then, I've had exercise-induced asthma. And I get bronchitis super easy ever since I've had that Tdap vaccine. So here, and then the flu vaccine, I volunteered 3 years in a row to take it. This before it became mandated everywhere. And I got sick for 3 or 4 months every year, 3 years in a row. And I'm like, wait a second. And I'd made my mom get it. I made my whole family get it. And all 3 of them, they had fever for a week, flu-like illness for a week. They missed work for a week. All 3 of them, 3 years in a row that I made them get it. So at this point, the idea that we're told, oh, you don't get sick from it. If you did, it was coincidence, or it would not have been as bad. Didn't make any sense. 3 years in a row, we all got sick. Now the father of my kids, he could take it fine, didn't have a problem. So his genetics were different than mine. He took it fine, had no issues at all. So, but I still didn't connect that to vaccine reactions. Just it's just bad luck, So then when I had my children, I thought I was kind of wild and crazy. I'm like, I'm not going to give her the hepatitis B vaccine. That was the extent of my anti-vaccine kind of thing. But I was like, well, I don't have hepatitis B. It's transmitted via IV drugs, sex, or by the vaginal delivery, but I didn't have it. So I was like, I'll wait to 2 whole months to give it. So she didn't have anything for the 2 months, and then but she's this calm, easy, very alert, looking around, very relaxed. Her hands were relaxed. I remember reading about the nervous system in mature babies, how they are just more relaxed versus the really tight kids like this. And the first set of vaccines, she had the inconsolable crying, fever. I gave her Tylenol multiple times, which now I've learned is probably not the best option. Mm-hmm. And she went from being that relaxed kid to that drawn up kid, and kind of crying a lot. And each set of vaccines, she cried more and more and more. But then we're told about the periods of purple crying in 2 to 6 months. Well, is that really a thing in unvaccinated children, or is that us come up with what's happening to vaccinated children, because until that point, she didn't cry all the time. She was an easy baby. And so
tell me, when do vaccines start? Because I'm not a pediatrician or a family practice. What age do they start giving those?
At birth.
At birth.
Hepatitis B.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I can't remember. I mean, see, again, me as a mother and a physician never question, right? I just go to the pediatrician. They tell me what has to be done, and I take it. That's it.
Me too. Except for that. I was like, well, I'll just wait the 2 months for that. That's literally the extent of my pushback, and I didn't even think beyond that. The other thing is I didn't want them to have the flu vaccine because I'd had so many reactions to it. And in retrospect, I actually found where they were still giving it to them without my permission. My mom always took them because I was working. So in retrospect, I actually found where they had given it anyway.
She signed a consent for it?
My mother did, but my mother didn't know. My mother just didn't know. And I had written a note to the doctor, please don't give this vaccine. But per their records, they still got it. Anyway, but still I didn't connect the vaccines. I just I was trained, well, this is when they cry more. I'm like, okay, and I watched her over time, and she's super smart. She knew her colors. She could point out colors before she was 12 months of age. Like she could point it out. She knew her alphabet by 15 months of age. And she was super just astute, but she was also that she had some sensory issues. She couldn't handle Velcro, and she couldn't handle the socks this way, and she would stack things, and the kids would go this way and she'd go that way. So she had some, but yeah, she'd make eye contact. It wasn't like she was autistic by any means. She made eye contact and she was verbal, but she was just kind of odd. She just had some things that just didn't make sense. And
was it like obsessive compulsive patterns?
She was obsessive compulsive and super stressed out. She could, if you went outside of any schedule, she would just she couldn't handle it.
Get overwhelmed if there's a change.
Right. And then somewhere around 2, I remember my mom freaking out. She stopped remembering things like she used to. It's like she just doesn't remember, because at that point I was spreading things out a little bit more, because I was like, maybe we can just spread things out, The
vaccines, you mean?
For vaccines. Not thinking it was still vaccine reactions. I still didn't have that. But I was like, oh, let's just spread it out. It just seems like a lot. But we watched her, all of a sudden she couldn't retain the things that she was retaining at first, and then I had another baby 14 months behind her. And so by the time she was 3, the middle child developed dermatomyositis, which is an autoimmune disease. And the pediatrician said it was like a classic case of dermatomyositis after a case of strep infection. And so instead of going to the rheumatologist, that's when I was like, something's fishy here. So I took her to the homeopath, and it took about 6 months. That's a whole other really cool story in itself of how it's not placebo. We watched the rashes and the photophobia just respond beautifully. And of course, by the end, when it was all gone, the pediatrician was like, well, maybe I was wrong. I was like, but you said it was a classic case. It's better now, thank God. Anyway, so that happened. And then as those 2 got older, I had my 3rd child. And the 3rd child, I just had a bad feeling. I'm like, something's just not right. I should not be having these kids with these weird stuff. And that's when I started to learn about methylation issues and mitochondrial dysfunction. And so when the little one was 4 months of age, I went ahead and had them all tested. And the oldest was homozygous for 1298. The youngest was homozygous C677T.
Ooh.
And the middle child was compound heterozygous. And the oldest and the youngest one had mitochondrial oat and Nutrival test. So they were both showing mitochondrial dysfunction. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to vaccinate this little one. But at the same time, so I kind of stopped, but she's already having all these food sensitivity issues and belly bloating and pica symptoms. And then I was kind of in denial. I felt like a terrible mother physician afterwards, but I was so afraid to go to the doctor at this point. I was afraid to go to the doctor because I didn't want to vaccinate her. I didn't feel comfortable because I got a bad feeling. And so I kind of avoided the doctor for a long time. And she actually lost weight and I didn't even recognize it, even though, because she's there in front of you every day and she's eating tons of food. Turns out she's having malabsorption. So we ended up, her dad was like, let's try to fatten her up with some gluten and try to fatten her up. And then she ended up in the hospital with massive diarrhea. And that was a whole other, the GI doctor was like, food has nothing to do with it. Mother's perceptions of food sensitivities. They wanted to give her they gave her hamburgers and pizza at the hospital when she was 13 months old. They wanted to give her formula with Hershey's syrup. And I'm like, and then she accused me of being one of those Whole Foods moms trying to ruin her kid's gut. You know, you're like, you know, I was like left so confused. How it's like, how can it be? I felt like, honestly, I was in the twilight zone. So between that and then my oldest child at that point says, like, was that vaccine reactions? Because I didn't know that vaccines actually indeed have casein protein, soy protein. They have all these food proteins in there with the aluminum adjuvant solutions. Did that contribute to that? And when she was that sick, she actually stopped walking, stopped talking. She actually regressed when she was that sick. So that was all that going on. At the same time, the oldest child was due her 5-year vaccines. And at this point, I'm like, something's really fishy. And at this point, I started wondering about the vaccines heavily. But I still, as a mother and as a physician, I didn't know I had a choice. So I went and got all 4 vaccines done at her 5-year shots. And I went and prayed the night before, please, God, don't let her have a reaction that I cannot handle. And because I literally didn't know I had a choice. I didn't know about religious exemption. I didn't know about VAERS reactions. And so lo and behold, she had fever 103. Her legs swelled up so much and so painful and indurated. She couldn't walk for like several days. It wasn't paralysis, it was due to severe pain in that left leg where I'm pretty sure she had the DTaP there. And that's when she started with facial tics, like severe facial tics that lasted several years. She still has them to this day, it's just not as often as what it was. She cried, she very emotional labile for a couple months after that, just would cry and cry and cry. And I actually, when I looked at old pictures, you could see her eyes are not straight. You know, the one eye was off, whereas I didn't notice that in earlier pictures. And so she ended up with, later on, as we got her diagnosed, she had auditory processing, visual processing disorder, ADHD, and a lot of food sensitivities. And thanks to homeopathy and functional medicine and brain balance, which is functional neurology, we got her a lot better. We're still paying on her functional neurology treatments, which honestly made a huge difference for her. And that's when I was like, okay, then I got mad. Then I got angry because I'm like, at myself, I felt like really a failure at this point because I went in knowing that she's having vaccine reactions and I still vaccinated her. This tells you the cognitive dissonance of a physician, that this makes me not anti-vaccine. I'm not anti-vaccine. It's like I vaccinated my child knowing that it was going to cause her harm because this is what we're supposed to do. And what I realized is I was not even trained as to what VAERS was. I didn't even know about VAERS still at this point. I didn't learn about that till another year after that, which is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It's a passive reporting system. And I still didn't even know about it. But the pediatrician kind of blew me off. And I wrote letters that had the reactions in it. No response. Did you get receipt? Yes. No response. So honestly, I'm still so angry to this day. I can't even go there to ask for the medical exemption because I'm not sure how I'll behave. You know,
just to backtrack, right? So this is like almost 5 years. In other words, your oldest child received all the vaccinations she needed to. But explain what the methylation, the homozygous, this was a 1289 that she had, and what are the mitochondrial, markers that you found? What has that got to do with anything?
Well, in mainstream medicine, nothing. Like we're trained that has nothing to do with anything.
As far as mainstream medicine goes, we don't even check these things. And I don't think prior to functional medicine, I even knew about it. I think we read about it for a moment, but I don't think we applied it.
I think in regular medicines, we learn the extremes. Like you learn what Cushing's is, which is like, adrenal excess. You learn what Addison's is, which is total adrenal insufficiency. But in between, you're just crazy. So we learn the extremes of everything. Like the mitochondrial dysfunction, you think of mitochondrial disorders where kids are like having seizures and really sick.
Yeah, genetic abnormality.
Could you have some dysfunction of your mitochondria, and it creates some symptoms in between that then when you have mitochondrial disruptors, medicines or chemicals or vaccines that can further disrupt that, then it creates more neurologic issues or musculoskeletal issues. We don't really learn that very much in medical
So some children are basically wired such that their mitochondria are not really good. So when you immunize them, there's a reaction. Am I understanding that right?
That's what, at least what my reading is, and within my understanding of the integrative ideas of this is, and again, just knowing that, like, I know that in regular medicine, they're being taught now about MTHFR, that it's just an integrative fallacy, that it's just not true. But I would say most of the people that, because I take care of a lot of children with vaccine reactions now, and most of them do have methylation issues, like the MTHFR gene or the COMT or some of the other, there's a whole constellation of methylation genes. True. Or they have mitochondrial dysfunction on their organic amino acid test or their Genova Nutraval test. It'll show mitochondrial dysfunction. I can't remember now what the actual markers were for them because it's been several years because they're older now, but you just said in general mitochondrial dysfunction. So it can, at least in our understanding, set them up for failure for this. And now sort of my thoughts are, does that mean, because no one's going to check for all of that before they vaccinate every child?
Oh yeah,
right?
No, it's not going to happen. Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. So what would be nice is if what I want out of this is for people to come study my kids or study other children that have vaccine reactions. Say, all right, so what set these kids up for these vaccine reactions? Did the parents have vaccine reactions? Like, I had multiple vaccine reactions. So there's a family history. So I have autoimmune disease. So does that predispose kids? Is it the MTHFR, or is it MTHFR plus A plus B plus C? Is it like maybe 3 genes together? Maybe it's that mitochondrial stuff plus the MTHFR. We don't know because no one is willing to study it. Like I feel like the responsible thing is for Western medicine, who says, hey, vaccines are the greatest thing since peanut butter. And we're going to apply just a one size fits all process. And there's just simply going to be collateral damage. I remember warning that there's just simply collateral damage. Some kids are going to die. Some kids are going to be harmed, but it's 1 in a million. It's 1 in a million. Well, my kids are clearly not just 1 in a million. I had 3 kids in a row that had random reactions, right? So what I feel like is the responsible thing of science to do is say, okay, well, let's study those kids that have reactions, and let's figure out all these. Were they breastfed? Were they formula fed? Were they in daycare? Were they at home? Were they do they have a moldy house? They have black mold in their house or not? Any environmental toxins in the area? Did the mom smoke? Not smoke. Was the mom an alcoholic? All those things. And I was pretty much eating organic food, and I had these kids with these issues. So causation does not mean, a correlation does not mean causation.
Does not mean causation, right?
Right. But I think that you have to look for patterns, and what the parents are crying out now in this country, that there are patterns to be paid attention to. There's a growing movement, and they would gain a lot more people to get more vaccines if they would gain our trust. But to gain our trust, they have to listen to us and not shun us as soon as we have. So here I'm a mother and a physician who was shunned by the pediatrician and by peers. Some of my friends that are doctors, they're just now hearing of my oldest daughter's reactions because they just couldn't hear it. They couldn't hear it. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I think they couldn't, they didn't care, because I think they care about me. I think they care about my children. They just couldn't, they couldn't bear to.
I think that's a judgment that comes in before listening to the facts, because the indoctrination of a physician. Let me give you another example. This is a very classic example. The 2 greatest inventions or discoveries or treatment protocols, one is vaccine and the other is the discovery of antibiotics. Right before penicillin, women just died after childbirth if they had, postpartum fever. Now, we have the antibiotics, but penicillin, such a phenomenal antibiotic, could be used for so many things. Some people have anaphylactic reaction to penicillin. Does that mean that the next time you have an infection, you'll never take any other antibiotic? No.
Right.
What we did at Physicians, we found an alternative to penicillin. That's what we do for our patients. Okay, my patient is having a reaction to something that is, better than, or the next thing, greatest after sliced bread or whatever they call it. And yet, I don't shun my patient because my patient says that my throat closes up if you give me penicillin, right? That's number one. Why do we have this visceral reaction when it comes to vaccines? Why are we so angry? I mean, I've never seen a topic. Maybe we were not there at the time where, hand washing is important for physicians. we were not in that era, but when I read the history of medicine, it seems like there was the same degree of anger, because I think if you look at that particular event where hand washing was required, the guy said you had toxins. Physicians carried toxins in their head. It's how he put it. So the whole physician community went ballistic. Now, why do we have so much anger when it comes to vaccines? And is it because it's misrepresented? I almost feel what you're talking about is not anti-vaccine. You're not saying don't vaccinate your kids. You're saying there is a pattern and there are some risks. Why can't we study those and try to create a different schedule for those kind of kids? That's what you're saying. But when you go to the real movement, it's almost like, I don't want to vaccinate, because even now, I think if you see Facebook posts, people are asking if the COVID-19 vaccine comes, will you get it? And people are answering yes or no. It's so interesting when I go to the regular physicians group, everybody says yes. When I go to the functional medical physicians group, everybody says no. When I go to, I'm a part of a leadership group where not many of them are physicians, or in fact, nobody's a physician. Everybody says yes. And some people say no. It's like mixed. We're all confused, right? So why is there so much emotion? What do you think? Because you're in this world, you're fighting for your kids. Why is there so much anger? Did you go through that process of being angry on the other side, right? No one's listening to me.
I got, now before I figured out the whole vaccines, I did have people who did not believe in vaccines. And honestly, they were so healthy, I hardly ever saw them. So I was like, it's your choice as your kids. I never fortunately was ever that doctor on the other side. I did go through anger after I had the reactions with my kids, because I felt totally abandoned. I felt abandoned by the pediatrician, and I felt abandoned by society, because suddenly I became a crazy mom, bad doctor, a quack for questioning vaccines. Then I got angry at our medical education for not teaching me about VAERS, for not teaching me about...
Explain what VAERS is so people know.
VAERS is a passive reporting system that actually your doctor is really, if you have a vaccine reaction, your doctor is supposed to make the report, but that a parent can also...
Oh, you froze again. Sorry.
For the government to, am I still?
You froze for a moment, but
I'm not sure
VAERS it's V for vaccine, A for adverse events and reporting system, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the problem is that in the last 5 years that you feel, I want you to remember, like although there's this whole anti-vaccine movement and people concerned about it 10 or 20 years ago, it's really picked up steam in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And so people on the other side, the pro-vaccine side, have unfortunately taken the opportunity to post, I turn into the Incredible Hulk. See how easy it is to put like anything on there. So that they're totally dismissing the main system that parents can actually report, which is unfortunate, because if that's the only place we can report and that's being dismissed, then where do we go? Like where are we supposed to report it, you know?
Who created the VAERS?
The government did. The government, because they in 1986 they created the National Vaccine Childhood Safety Act, where they took all liability away from vaccine makers. Right, so you cannot sue the vaccine.
Why did they do that?
Because there were so many reactions against the DTaP. That was the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. The DTaP, DTP. It was prior to the new version, DTP vaccine. They were having so many issues with encephalitis and serious reactions due to that for like 20 years that, quite frankly, they dismissed those parents too. That they went to the government and said, listen, we're not going to keep on vaccinating because we're being sued left and right. And what's the incentive for us to keep doing this? So the government said, wow, we've got to protect the public health. So to do this, we have to protect the vaccine makers. So indeed, they protected them from all liability. They paid a tax on each vaccine, on each component. Like an MMR, there's a 75% tax on the M, and the R, the measles, mumps, and the rubella. So they pay into this tax thing that supports the vaccine court. But But in return, we're supposed to have this VAERS, this Vaccine Safety Reporting System. The Department of Health and Human Services was supposed to do regular checks for safety, which turns out they were not doing. They actually, there was a lawsuit by RFK and Del Bigtree. They won, showing that they were not doing their regular safety studies that they were required to do by this law. So the VAERS came around to have this passive reporting system in order to try to detect these patterns.
And who's checking what is being reported and what are they doing about it? Why do we even have the system?
Well, I mean, theoretically, so the Department of Health and Human Services can actually detect patterns, and so they can help us have a safer vaccine schedule.
Okay.
But like I said, I'm not really sure. We've not had anything removed, and everything I know we have are called coincidences. Like when you talk to most people, like, oh, it's just coincidences. Like my children, I've been told by people like, oh, you just imagined it. I literally had someone say, well, maybe your child had a head injury after a vaccine that you just didn't see. I literally was told that by someone. I'm like, so my 5-year-old had a major concussion in the 2 hours between her fever and her vaccines, and I didn't know. Okay, sounds like a likely story. So the government's supposed to be looking at that for patterns. I just don't know, honestly, if they're making any decisions on that because we just keep having vaccines added. So we went from having, like my mother's generation had like 10 doses of vaccines their entire childhood. And really, only the wealthier ones even had all those vaccines. It was like maybe only half the country had those at that time. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the 80s, I had 24 doses of vaccines as a child. That was sort of the standard. And the vaccine rates were improving, but it still wasn't optimal. And then now children have 24 doses of vaccines by 6 months of age. Mm-hmm. They have 46 doses of vaccines by 6 years of age and over 70 doses by 18 years of age. And all that's happened since the vaccine makers were made immune for lawsuits. So I find that concerning, the fact that we have this VAERS, this Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, that's being dismissed wholeheartedly by most doctors I know as being not worthwhile of even looking at. But then we're tripling the vaccine schedule, and there's like a carte blanche for how many more vaccines are going to be added, and you're not allowed to discuss it. You're not allowed to ask questions, or you're considered anti-vaccine. And that's the other thing too, is that there's really, have they studied one vaccine versus 3 versus 6? When they vaccinate a 6-month-old against 9 different diseases, have they studied that versus 6 diseases versus 2 versus 1? And the reality is that study doesn't exist for safety. So that's the other thing. Honestly, I would love to happen is have us really reevaluate the true vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, which Paul Thomas was trying to do, and he actually just got in trouble and had his license revoked for that purpose. He literally had a peer-reviewed article put out where they collected the data of the CDC schedule, a modified schedule versus unvaccinated, and there's a dramatic difference in all kinds of disease processes. And he just literally lost his license for just publishing a peer-reviewed article.
Well, somebody accepted his article.
Yeah, someone accepted his article. And not only that, but the Oregon Medical Board actually sent an independent reviewer out for his data when he first presented the data, and they confirmed the data. So it was actually, his clinic has 13,000 children, and like, what a great opportunity, right? And he's about medical freedom. Like, if you want the vaccines, he supports you getting vaccines. He's not anti-vaccine. He actually, in his family, they traveled a lot, and they did lots of vaccines in their own family. So, but he was recognizing, oh, I'm seeing these patterns here. And so he studied the patterns, and just by studying the patterns, he actually now lost his license. And it's simply for posting this peer-reviewed article, which is terrifying. So how are we supposed to ask questions? Like in science, if anyone tells you, honestly, in my opinion, if they say science is settled, you need to run the other direction, because that's terrifying to think science is never settled. That's the pure definition of science, is that we're ever learning, we're ever changing our mind. I mean, heck, eggs were terrible for you at one point. Now they're good for you. Like we change our minds all the time based upon new data. And science actually starts with your eyes. It starts with your observations, but we're being trained that you're not allowed to use your common sense. You're not allowed to use your brain, your eyes, your hands. You have to only trust the study that's paid for by pharma. And that makes no sense. I'm thankful for pharma. I'm thankful for meds. I'm thankful for all the advances in science. But if that's the only source of truth, I mean, that becomes dogma. Like if you are not allowed to even use your own observation, if I'm not allowed to go in and like actively vaccinate my child and then have her have reactions, then I'm considered like there's something wrong with me. That's not science. That's actually simply, I was being a mother trying to figure out what to do. Fully vaccinated my child. So this is dogma. This is not science. Dogma is something you cannot question without retaliation against your character, without societal pressure to ruin your life. That's dogma. Science is the ever debate of like, who can get better science? How can we push the envelope? And in vaccine science, they have different set of rules compared to regular vaccines. So vaccines often will have, medicines, let me take a step back. Medicines should, in a study, use true placebo. Placebo is a truly inert substance that has no physiological effect on you. It has no effect on your body, right? Well, in vaccines are considered biologics. So they have a different set of rules that apply to them. So their placebos are either another vaccine or they will have an aluminum adjuvant solution. And in that aluminum adjuvant solution, it varies between the different vaccines. And the excipient list, the ingredient list is on the CDC website. So it does have aborted fetal cell lines. It does have bovine heart, the cow heart. It has monkey kidney cells called vero cells. You have soy protein, casein protein, and formaldehyde and polysorbate 80. You have all these ingredients, right, that's used as a placebo. Well, if that aluminum adjuvant is put in there to create an immune response to the antigen in there, the antigen is just the ingredient out here. So you've got this aluminum adjuvant, and you put it in there with all these different food proteins. And how do you know it's not going to cause an activation against those proteins? And you look at our food allergy epidemic that we have in this country, and no one's questioning the aluminum adjuvants in with all these food proteins. And the idea that you're going to inject this aluminum adjuvant in with this antigen and have a perfect immunologic response. It's going to respond perfect immunity, right? The reality is that some people under respond, so they don't become immune, or they over respond and they develop autoimmune disease, or they develop these other diseases, other inflammatory diseases as a response, right? So you're comparing that vaccine against the aluminum adjuvant solution or another vaccine for safety. Well, how do you know if it's safe if you're doing all these activated solutions here with it? I want a true placebo study, and we have enough. And I think, honestly, that's why pharma does not want, that's why they want mandates. They want to eliminate the possibility of having an unvaccinated population. Because I will tell you now, I have in my primary care practice, I have people who vaccinate fully. They just honestly, they go to the pediatrician and they come to me for all the integrative options. I have people who partially vaccinate. I have people who don't vaccinate, and I have people with vaccine injury. But I will tell you, I have so many families that where the first 2 or 3 kids were sick, asthma, allergies, ear infections, neurosensory issues. They stopped vaccinating, and then the next 3 kids are normal health. I have so many families like that. I mean, talk about it, your own studies, right? Same 2 parents, then total different outcomes, whether or not we're putting in immune modulators. Now, again, I'm attracting this population of people probably for the reason that they are not tolerating these vaccines like everyone else is, right? So you still might have the majority do just fine, but in this population, they are not doing fine. So these are the people that we should be studying and say, all right, what are the commonalities in here? So you do that, but then we also need to go back and say, is our vaccine schedule really, truly scientific? How can we say it's really, truly scientifically sound and safe when we have not compared it to true placebo, when we have not compared these vaccines in conjunction together? There's 2 different sides that need to be addressed to have it be scientifically sound.
So true placebo will be something like distilled water or
like a saline solution, I guess.
A saline solution, yeah. So something that normally we realize does not create an immune reaction.
Right.
But everything other than just the antigen or the protein of the bug that we're trying to get you to have an immune reaction to, they're putting it into the placebo, and they're calling that a placebo, and you don't believe that's a true way to look at it, correct? Do they have studies for every vaccine? Do they have studies for every vaccine that they put
Well, they
out?
have studies for every vaccine. Every vaccine has to have studies, but they don't have to have studies against placebo. Which, I mean, to me, how did that possibly make that into any scientific acceptance?
Yeah.
Right? And even then you have there is such a fear of questioning. There's a wonderful hepatitis B vaccine. If you look up new hepatitis B vaccine, CDC, on YouTube, it actually comes up, and they're talking about a new hepatitis B vaccine. I think it's called Interjects. And we already have a hepatitis B vaccine that's been in use for a long time, and they try to get this new hepatitis B vaccine approved, and it had failed several times. It had been shot down several times. But in this meeting, they basically vote 100% for it, even though it's got a new different adjuvant in it that has not really been studied. And then after they vote 100% for it, then they start talking about the abnormal signal for myocardial infarction or a heart attack. So like, well, we are a little bit concerned about this myocardial infarction signal. Are we going to continue studying this in the post-market analysis? How is this going to be in pregnancy? We don't have the data yet. Okay, well, we're going to do this in post-market analysis. So there's all these concerns that they had prior to voting for 100%, but they all had to say, we're so excited about the advancement of science that we can approve another hepatitis B vaccine, even though it's causing people to have heart attacks.
Yeah, I think I've seen that video, but I don't know. It looked like a very old video. I don't even know which year it was shot.
It's within the last 2 or 3 years. It was a grainy video from a cell phone. It's actually relatively recent.
Yeah. So basically, the population is their study. So then something like the VAERS should be taken seriously, because if your population, you're going to just give this vaccine because you believe for the greater good of most people, it's going to be useful. There is going to be collateral damage, like you mentioned. And we just want to know how significant is that collateral damage. Like if the disease is going to take out 1% of the population, if the vaccine just takes out 0.25 of the population, is that a risk versus benefit? But if the vaccine is going to take out 0.25 of the population and create 10% of disability, is it really something that we all should be mandated to take? I think the question here is the mandate, right?
Right. The mandate is the big question.
Yeah. It's really, I think if people really need to look at it, it's not about you have the choice. In fact, we hear of this where kids become 18 and their parents have held off vaccines from them, and then they go and get the vaccine on their own because now they can sign for consent for this. But that is the other extreme where people just are afraid of vaccines. Like I have patients who will say, my neighbor had a colonoscopy and they ruptured his colon. I'm never going to go for a colonoscopy, right? That's how. And you'll find a lot of moms who will just not take their kids for vaccination because of this information that's floating around. How does a mother figure out whether that child that they have is not going to have a reaction? Is there some telltale signs? Like in you, I think you had vaccine reaction. You just hadn't put it together.
Right.
Because but is there something that you see in your families that you take care of that prior to them getting the vaccination? Is this something, is that like a questionnaire or, these 3 things that I feel are a red flag? Have you noticed anything that might be useful for people?
Well, I just think that most of them that decide not to, there are a couple different things. One is that they've already had kids with vaccine reactions, so they stop. Or they had a family member who had severe vaccine reactions, and they're afraid the same thing's going to happen to their kids.
I would say no. Actually, I remember having a mother in my practice who never had any. Her first child, she just refused to immunize, and she really wanted a letter from me saying that for religious reasons they don't want to vaccinate. But I'm not a pediatrician, and we sat together and tried to search for someone who will give her a different they discharged her from that practice because if you don't vaccinate your child, you cannot be a part of their practice, the hospital.
Which I think is against the Hippocratic Oath, quite frankly. I think it's
everybody does that. I mean, that's the one that made me go back and look at the history of medicine, because I was shocked at the anger of a physician saying, I will not have this patient in my practice because they will not vaccinate. And their rationale was, An unvaccinated child in my practice is a danger to my vaccinated kids in the practice.
But if your vaccines work, then you don't have to worry about the unvaccinated child.
Right. I mean, that is one part, but he actually vaccinated. In fact, I was reading a study yesterday, and because I'm preparing for this vaccine conversation that I'm going to have for a big group, there is a good percentage of vaccinated individuals who get the disease. Yes. So it's not, the immune response in every individual is very different. Some people get tenfold antibodies, are very robust, and others barely get any response. And these studies have been there. They are conducted. They are there. And they've also noticed children under the age of 8 months do not have such a robust response for many of the vaccines as they do after 8 months.
That's why they do it at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, because it doesn't take. So I'm of the argument, why not wait till they're older and then vaccinate, so that way it sticks and you have less toxin burden. That's why. And then that's the other group too, though, is like, I do have people who just don't vaccinate at all, but they're like homeschooled, like they live on a farm.
If you're homeschooled, you're going to go to Disney Park sometime. You're going to be going to.
They're healthy. They're never sick.
I know. I mean, I hear what you're saying, because see, I come from a country where infectious diseases is still an issue. Even today, it's an issue. It's not like it's completely, and despite that, COVID is better controlled in India than in the United States. You know, it's amazing how the IT part, like where they track the cases and how they inform people, is very different. Everybody has to have this app downloaded on their phone. In fact, I went to India recently. And so I took about 3 or 4 flights. I can't remember. It was a 22-hour journey. And I saw this beautiful big hospital next to my parents' home. So I had gone out for a walk, and I said, it's a beautiful hospital. Let me go see how they do COVID testing. Now, I could have just sat at home. I had just done my COVID testing and I entered the country. And lo and behold, I came back positive. And who called me and said I was positive? The government. And they immediately blacklisted me. They came and put a notice in front of my house saying that there's a COVID positive patient here. And so everybody, all the help of the house stopped coming. The gardener would not come, the cook would not come, the maid would not come, and like nobody wanted to come. And then they arranged a person who will come every day and say, can we buy groceries for you? Because nobody in the house had to go out. So that was what happened. And everybody who came with me on the flight got a notification that they were exposed to somebody who had COVID. Now, I fought that because I felt it was a false positive and made the government come and retest me, and I was negative. 2 tests, I was negative after that. And I got that removed. But I'm just saying that's how much that, how they have been able to control, because they're identifying the case. And if I went to a store, for whatever reason, I had to remove my mask, and they took a picture of me in the store that I entered that store with my telephone number. That's how much was going on in India with the COVID-19. That being said, I will say infectious diseases were a huge problem, particularly polio when I was growing up. And children who became disabled due to polio would never have a normal life. We have for disability, we have a lot of things in place to treat them special. Whereas in India, they would just be on the streets begging if they didn't have a hand that moved or a leg that moved. It was very difficult. So having said that, that's the vaccine schedule. At that time, there were just few vaccines. And I remember in school too, standing in line for a cup of milk and cookie. That's what they would give after vaccines. So you stood in line, and cookies were like gold for us. We would stand in line just to get the vaccines so we could get a cookie after that. So that's how they trained us. Now I come in here, and now I'm hearing all these things about vaccine reactions. Where was all this in the 70s and 80s? Is it because they were much lesser, or because we have more vaccines? Why has there been this shift? And what can you do about it?
I still wonder if it's just the epigenetic expression, like the amount of vaccines I got and it turning on maybe a gene And then that created because my mom didn't remember me having vaccine reactions as a kid. I'm not sure if my mom would have paid attention, honestly. But she said I did fine with vaccines. And honestly, me actually getting it as an adult, I did fine with it at the time. I just developed a new autoimmune disease with each one within 6 months to a year, right? So is it that is the burden that my generation have, and then we pass down that genetic expression to this generation, where then they're getting triple the doses of vaccines. So
but how do you study something like this? How can you even study it?
I think you have to still look at the collateral damage people, like do genetic testing.
So how many would you say right now? Do you have like a number compared to like?
It's impossible to know because, again, my pediatrician would never have even reported my kids. We would not even be counted, even though she didn't consider it. I think that's the problem, is that we're being trained.
You could go and report in VAERS, right?
I could go to report it, and I just know now as a doctor. But what about other normal parents?
Yeah. So we need to really educate people about VAERS. Number one. Number two, it's not like everybody should make a choice of whether to vaccinate or not. There are certain patterns that you should be looking out for in your family, and then have that discussion with a physician. And I think for physicians, I don't think we should at any time just dismiss a patient because you've been taught differently. That's how you learn new things.
Do I dismiss my smokers? Do I dismiss my diabetics who eat like ice cream? And people say, oh, but it's like an infectious disease thing. But the reality is that the majority, we're looking at vaccines as one entity, but it's not just one entity. It's a very diverse population of medical treatments. For instance, hepatitis B in a low risk family makes no sense. So I feel like being able to risk stratify the actual vaccine versus the risk of disease. Hepatitis B in a low risk family is pretty much zero. Like, I mean, forget about it. We test for hepatitis B in our blood supply here. Like, if there's no IV drug use in your family, your kid's just simply not going to get hepatitis B.
Right.
Even if a kid bites you at school, like the odds of that one child that is rare that has hepatitis B to bite your child is just beyond lightning strike. The flu, we know that the flu vaccine is not that effective. We know that the measles is 93 to 97% effective. So you look at that difference in the efficacy of those two vaccines, right? You see, like you said, you don't make antibodies. You don't mount antibodies. So why not save that polio vaccine? I'm not saying not to vaccinate against polio. Why not wait till they're 2? And that way they gets rid of 4 of the doses where the body doesn't really care about it and they're not really exposed.
So that's why we give this vaccine so frequently. It's because they don't mount in the response. That is crazy. That's how much money we're wasting. That's wasting. Like, you're taking a drug that's ineffective for, this is biologic. So it's actually creating a reaction, but I don't think anybody would spend money to take something that's ineffective and saying the 5th time when we give it to you, it's going to be effective.
Right. But the problem is we're also being trained as doctors. If you don't get it in there, they could die. Like, I know pediatricians who they don't wait till 8 weeks. They're like, we got to get them at 6 weeks because they could die. I remember talking to, honestly, a friend of mine, thank God she's kind of waking up now to it, but she knew I was kind of on this train, and she said, oh, I have this kid who is getting constant ear infections, sick all the time, and due for the 12-month shots. Which one do I skip today? I'm like, skip all of them until you fix the immune system. You have to repair the immune system before you put more immune modulators in. She's like, you mean like to next week? I'm like, well, no. Like, she's like, but what if they die? I'm like, were you worried about them dying 2 weeks ago? Well, no. All right, so what makes them different at 11 and a half months versus 12 and a half months? As like, we don't fear the 11-month-old is going to die from measles, from not like spontaneous measles, or at 10 months or at 6 months, right? And that's the dogma again that we have been trained. And so that's why we're like, oh, they could die. And probably the biggest risk for a baby at that point is baby pertussis or Hib meningitis, which is still not that common, but it's definitely reduced with the Hib vaccine. But, you look at that kind of thing, and maybe what we could do is risk stratify. Can we not risk stratify? Well, you've got a home, like breastfed baby versus a kid being put into daycare.
Yeah.
A formula-fed baby. Could we not try to risk stratify and pick and choose? Like, I believe that we're in the day and age that we have enough information and understanding for personalized medicine, even on a macro public health level. Like, if we could still there's saving polio, the IPV, the inactivated polio for 2 years of age in a country where we don't have polio is not going to bring back polio. It's just simply not. Now, if you have a family who goes to polio, maybe have that as a requirement. Say, hey, if you're going to go to polio, go to India, you got to get the polio vaccine. But I don't know if you know this, but IPV does not prevent transmission of polio.
Yeah.
It just decreases the risk, the neurologic risk. The risk of having neurologic polio is still less than 1%.
I think for most vaccines, that's what it is. It's like it tones down the disease, severity of the disease. Not many of them actually will prevent the transmission. Like, you are vaccinated, and which is why we're asked to take the flu vaccine, right? Every physician every nurse has to take the vaccine. So we don't give it. We are not a silent carrier, and we give it to the patients.
But the reality is that you can transmit it.
Yeah.
Which defeats the whole purpose.
I know, but these are the things that they tell us. And in fact, when I gave up medicine, that was one of the things that I found, the freedom, right? Where I can practice in Michigan in a hospital if I don't have flu vaccine.
Yeah, there's not enough science to back it up.
Yeah, but who's going to fight it? And how do you fight this?
Well, I did fight it. I would say, some would say I lost it. I say I won it because I have an awesome practice and I'm much happier. But the flu vaccine, which, I had the good fortune of presenting the data to you before, but the gist is basically it doesn't decrease transmission rates, hospitalization rates. It does not decrease complication rates. And it's only effective 20 to 40% of the time. And there actually does increase risk of upper respiratory infection after the vaccine, and it does increase hospitalization in children ages 6 months to 18 years of age. So it does everything opposite of what we're being told it does.
But they report when an elderly who never had the flu vaccine or the pneumonia vaccine dies of pneumonia, they will report it. But I used to see a lot of elderly in the hospital. I was a hospitalist who died despite the vaccine or pneumonia, but they don't report that.
No.
Yeah.
No, I had a baby, like, this is a great example of, this is the bias that's in reporting out there. So I had a 5-month-old baby who was unvaccinated who developed pertussis. She lives out in the country, sweet lady. And she just wanted to wait and give it time because she was at home all the time. The uncle and the cousin who were fully vaccinated up to date with the Tdaps, the 7-year-old cousin, they both had bronchitis, came to visit the baby. The baby developed this cough. I'm like, oh, I think this is like pertussis. I did the swab and went ahead and gave the azithromycin. But we also did actually homeopathy, which made a really big difference actually in the cough and the vitamin C protocols. But the health department, of course, called. They're like, oh, the baby needs vaccinated right away. I'm like, well, not while sick. You never vaccinate a baby when sick, you know, and also doesn't need the pertussis vaccine at this point now because he already has it. I was like, but you might want to know that the uncle and the cousin came and they apparently gave it to the baby. That was the only visitor in the last 2 weeks. They're like, well, did they have the vaccine? Yes. Well, then they're fine. I'm like, no. They are the ones who brought the pertussis to the baby. So they have pertussis. And they're like, well, if they've had the vaccine, they did not want to investigate. So the health department did not go check them out. So then she told the uncle and the cousin, all right, go to your doctor because I think y'all have pertussis because y'all are the only visitors we've had. So they go to the doctor. The doctor says, well, you've already been vaccinated. It cannot be pertussis. They're like, but we think it is. The doctor refused to test. So the health department refused to test. The doctor refused to test because they had the vaccine. It must be effective. Yet they were coughing their heads off from this bronchitis that they were diagnosed with. You see, that happens all the time.
Yeah. And, how does a patient stand up and where do they find doctors who can help them?
We're becoming, further and far between because I know so many doctors who are in corporate systems that don't actually vaccinate their own children. And And they tell me, they're like, I'm so afraid of coming forward. And they're given vaccines all the time. They're afraid to give any true informed consent because they don't want to be found out, because they know what the repercussions are.
So talk a little about the informed consent. I'm so glad you brought that up. I want people to understand what informed consent is. And because everybody gets this vaccine sheet. I'm guilty of it. I just throw it in the trash. I don't even read it. I used to give it. When I started my practice, I was very particular about giving it. And I would find at the end of my clinic in the waiting room, in the trash, everybody's notification. But what is informed consent?
Informed consent is really understanding, and I think it depends on which, what treatment you have. I think, and everyone, of course, is going to have a different opinion on this. And just as a plug, I'm on the board for Physicians for Informed Consent. I'm a founding board member. So if anyone's out there, we need support of providing opportunities for true informed consent for medical treatments. And this is for anything. And in true informed consent, you should have the right of understanding, like, what is the risk of this disease, of dying from it, of having true long-term disability from it, versus the risk of with this vaccine. What's the risk of having a vaccine reaction? How effective is it? And you should actually have the information for both. And quite frankly, I've been studying vaccines now for 6 years, and there's no way I could do informed consent on vaccines in 15 minutes. It would take me probably 60 minutes, and I would be just touching the tip of the iceberg. I almost feel like you need to take a course in this, and parents honestly need to study it themselves, because doctors are not being taught this information, and doctors honestly, quite frankly, refuse, because they feel like they already know all the information, because we don't need to study. And let me take a step back even on that one. I would have to say, we are taught in medicine, as you know, you're like drinking from the fire hydrant with medical information.
Yes.
And especially in family medicine, I'm having to learn how to manage kids and adults and endocrinology and cardiology and, all these different fields of medicine all in one. And so for us, vaccines are settled science, is safe and effective. We don't have to study it. We were so thankful to have a piece of medicine that we really didn't have to worry about, because it was done. It was signed, sealed, approved. We don't have to worry about it. So that was the extent of most of our education, is that it just works. Why would you not want it? Children in Africa are walking miles to go get their vaccine, right? And that's what you're told. So true informed consent really needs the true benefit and the risk of the disease versus the vaccine. And that takes more than that sheet of paper that says, oh, you just might get a little soreness at the site and a little injection. And I'm not even sure if I would have done anything differently with my kids, even given the information, for my kids, because how would I know my kids were going to react until they reacted? I had no clue.
Right.
But what would have made a difference in like my situation is that I would have recognized that those reactions she had at 2, 4, and 6 months were indeed serious reactions that were causing neurologic issues, that those are not, they might be common reactions, but you can have a common reaction that's quite indeed a pathological reaction. So she was having common pathological reactions, but I was trained that it was just normal, non-pathologic reactions. And this is where I think doctors have to start learning, what are real side effects? How do you recognize them? If you start seeing neurologic reactions in kids and you need to warn them, then we need to go slower for those kids. You need to say, all right, maybe we need to let that kid get 6 months of age and try one at a time. Let's pick the risks that your child has based upon the current situation as your child in daycare. Maybe we need to do Hib first, the Haemophilus influenza first. Maybe we need to do the Prevnar second, the pneumococcal second, because those are more of the infectious diseases that you would get in a daycare, right? So versus a stay-at-home mom, do you know what, let's wait, period, until they're like 9 months of age, and then do one at a time.
Yeah.
Informed consent is really understanding the true history of disease and the risk of disease and permanent disability, and recognize the reactions and respecting the mother or the father they know that child better than anyone else, and respect, oh, okay, you're having a reaction, just like you said, the penicillin. If you say you have a penicillin reaction and you don't have the documentation, sorry, I don't believe you. I'm going to have to give you that penicillin, even though you said you have an anaphylactic reaction, even because you don't have scientific proof that you had that reaction, and no one witnessed it, and you can't find the hospital records to prove it. That would be considered malpractice.
Yep.
But with vaccines, even if you have medical written notes, that means that doctor must have been crazy, you're dismissed, right? There was a nurse locally to us who said she had an anaphylactic reaction to the flu vaccine about 20 years ago. And they told her that she couldn't get out of it unless she found the records from the hospital. Well, 20 years ago is a whole different story with record keeping. She couldn't find the records. And they're like, well, you have 2 weeks or you lose your job. So she went in, she took some Benadryl before she took the vaccine. She ended up in the ICU for 2 weeks, like almost died. Because they said to keep your job, you have to basically try to die again to prove to us.
Did she make them pay for her vaccine?
I don't know what's happened since then. I don't know. She should sue the heck out of them.
That is so sad. That is actually very sad, because I know somebody tells me they've had a penicillin reaction. I don't even give them Keflex, even though it's less than 2% cross reactivity, because
unless that's the only choice.
Yeah.
Unless that's the only choice left.
Right. And people will tell you 10 times that they have a reaction, but vaccines, it's almost like a taboo. So let me ask you this. In an ideal, like you have a magic wand, what would an ideal situation look like for both doctors and patients?
An ideal situation was to have like Paul Thomas's study, the vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, published and actually vetted. And instead of shutting him down, have external people come and vet it and study it, right? I want a true vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. I want the studies to stop being fake placebos. I want true placebo studies. This whole idea of it's unethical to withhold life-saving treatment. Well, the aluminum adjuvant solution is not life-saving treatment. So that the whole argument does not, mandates simply cannot exist. Mm-hmm. And they're like, and the other side is coming to the point
what a mandate is.
Mandate, it depends on to what level. Mandates mean you have to have a vaccine or else, basically. Mm-hmm. And right now there's typically vaccine mandates for all public schools, but you can get a religious exemption or a medical exemption. Medical exemptions are nearly impossible to get. And if you do get it, it's just to that one vaccine. It's not to all the vaccines. So you can do religious exemption in most states. But if you don't have that, then you lose the right to a public education. And you lose the right to go to school. And people are like, well, that's your choice. It's kind of sad that like in California, though, that let's say you have a medical exemption that is not being honored in California right now, because now doctors are being criminalized for giving medical exemptions, literally criminalized. So now those children literally are going to lose the right to an education. And they're actually, for the coronavirus vaccine, everyone's about to face the idea that if this becomes mandated, the government started saying, don't worry, we're not going to mandate it, but you might not be able to keep your job. You might not be able to get a driver's license. You might not be able to travel out of country. You might lose your ability to feed your family, but don't worry, we're not going to mandate it. So there's that kind of mandate too, where society, where I consider it's mob rule. This is part of the democracy where mob rules, is that society, your boss who knows nothing about medicine, say you have to get the vaccine or else you can't work here, even though we know the vaccine does not decrease transmission rates, that you can still spread coronavirus, in spite of having it, but you cannot work here with it, no matter how sick it makes you, right? Because it's based out of fear. So we're having policymakers making like fear-based decisions, or legislators making decisions based upon their education from lobbyists, from pharma, right? So whether it's actually through legal means, through our legislators saying, hey, we're going to add even another vaccine to the school schedule. You cannot get a religious exemption, or you cannot have a philosophical exemption. You have to get it or else you can't go to school, versus it being societal mandates. We have to recognize that if there's a risk, how do you mandate something? And this is not Ebola where 50% of the people are dying. We're in a modern country where even those patients that had Ebola, when they transferred here, they all lived. You also can't compare a developing country versus a developed nation because of access of care. I'll have some of my homeschooling unvaccinated patients will go to, let's say, Africa to do a mission trip. They get vaccines when they go there because they have different risks there. They're not just ignoring, all vaccines are bad. They're like, where I am right now in my society, I do not think that risk is worth the benefit. They're going to another country where we might not have access to clean drinking water or clean water for wound care. I think it's worth the risk to this. I see those patients getting those vaccines.
Yeah.
Why is that not reasonable? You know, so again, you have to look at this. And yes, coronavirus is, for instance, more contagious than even measles, you know, but if the vaccine doesn't prevent transmission, then how is that going to be mandated? Especially, of course, it's a short-term study. We don't know long-term benefits, you know.
Yeah, we're not going to know the benefits or the risk till for a year.
But New York just has a bill already to mandate the vaccine.
So to go to New York, you have to be vaccinated?
Yeah, well, they have not passed the bill yet, but the bill just got proposed December 4th to have the COVID-19 vaccine to be able to be mandated across the state. So that means work, like school, whatever. And this is a vaccine. It's a whole new technology. It's, again, compared to the meningitis vaccine, not placebo. There's already been a death in the placebo arm with the meningitis vaccine. They've already halted multiple of the studies. And we know none of the long-term effects because it's brand new. We don't know anything with autoimmune disease.
The technique is also brand new with the messenger RNA creating the protein.
It's relatively new.
Yeah, the messenger RNA becomes a part of our cell and starts creating a new protein to which our body is going to say, I'm sorry, you.
And the risk is in the past when they've failed at the coronavirus vaccines that it created this immune priming. Basically, we expose you to it, and then the next time you get exposed, you get even sicker. So that's what they're finding. Even on the second dose of the vaccine, they get much stronger side effects. So what's going to happen when they get exposed to the actual virus? Do we know?
We don't know.
Do we even know this now? Are we going to have people who really get sick? You know, that's why they stopped the coronavirus vaccines in the past, because they were people getting sicker because of it. We don't know this, but out of fear, you know, we are, and I get everyone's fear. It's a real virus. I'm not diminishing that. But, you know, this coronavirus isn't going anywhere, but pandemics end within 1 to 2 years, pretty much in modern history, regardless of having a vaccine or not. So the idea of mandating this brand new technology, forcing it, and even if they don't mandate it, having society, I've already had, when you look in Facebook groups, oh, my staff, my employees are going to get it or else they can't work for me. So any boss can decide that. Any boss can determine your medical care.
Yeah.
It's a terribly dangerous and scary thing for me because I'm thinking about my children who I'm already still paying for the neurologic rehab for my oldest one. What's going to happen for her? And you look in D.C., Washington, D.C. has a bill that just very well may be passed this week that will allow 11-year-olds to make their own decisions regarding vaccines. Not only make their own decisions, but they will hide information to prevent the parent from knowing, to avoid retaliation from the parent. So a couple things there, that an 11-year-old can say yes to a vaccine, but they cannot say no to a vaccine. So if a parent wants the child, the 11-year-old, to have that vaccine, that child has no right to say no. But they have a right to say yes without the parent knowing. So if that child, let's say my daughter, who had all those neurologic reactions and food reactions and everything, to the vaccines, if she says yes, because I was talking to my kids about it, and my oldest, she said, well, why would I not get the vaccine if all my friends are getting it? She literally said that. I'm like, no, because again, I have not raised her thinking, oh, I'm a vaccine injured child, because that's not what I want. I want her just to be a normal child. Like, I just want to support her immune system and teach her how to be a normal child and not worry about this. So she's like, but I would, if all my friends are getting it, then clearly I would get it too. And I'm like, no, even though I've already had to talk with her to never take a vaccine without me being present, So I had to explain to them. But that's the thing, is here my child is with a significant medical history that she does not know, that her pediatrician refused to even put into her medical records, and the school doesn't know. Because I'm not going around talking to her, all of her teachers, make sure you don't vaccinate her because she had vaccine reactions. But this law in DC is to protect the child from the parent. So they are pitting children, teaching children they cannot trust their parent with their medical decisions. An 11-year-old, they're still playing Roblox and like video games, and they're like still learning what's real and what's not in life. They can't drive a car, they can't vote, but yet they can make a decision to put a medical like treatment into their body that can create immune issues and not know their medical history. I mean, so many problems here. And not to mention, still the least or the most of it is the fact that the government is teaching our children they cannot trust the parents. Yeah. To sneak from the parents. You have to hide from the parents. But when that child has that vaccine reaction and the parents seeing all of a sudden their child having these issues, and they take them to the ER, the ER is not even going to have the important information. They just have this vaccine. I mean, all the way down the road, this is like a terrifying thought that this bill is getting this close to being passed in Washington, D.C., among a very vulnerable population that's been taken advantage of historically when it comes to studies anyway. When you look at the Black families throughout history, we have taken advantage of them in medicine, experimented on them. And here's just another experiment, and we're taking advantage of the poverty there and of the population to say, oh, the government knows better, you cannot trust your parents. Even more undermining the family unit, which has already been decimated by our government.
Right. And I think
that's a whole other topic.
We could have a whole podcast on it, because there is a great book, which we discussed as before we went on live, is The Medical Apartheid. It's a beautiful book. I think both physicians and patients should read it. And it gave me a better understanding of why some group of people are very suspicious of any recommendations we make and their behavior. So what I feel needs to happen, and I heard this somewhere and I thought it made a lot of sense. Number one, I think we need to educate. First of all, we need to produce the facts. Tell people what the COVID-19 vaccine studies showed in terms of side effects, who was it tested on, how effective was it, and what to anticipate. Is it going to prevent them from getting the infection, or is it going to prevent them from transmitting the infection? Is it going to prevent them from getting a bad infection? You educate. You do this education 2-3 times in either in community centers or go to their homes. And once you educate and they feel like, now this makes sense to me, I want the vaccine, then give the vaccine. Right. Instead of saying, everybody gets it because we said so. Right. There's so much of fear right now instilled in every person's mind, both one about the disease, the other about the vaccine. It's very interesting to see that. And that's because we have partial facts. And no one's willing to talk about the real facts, whether it be Dr. Fauci, whether it be the government. I just don't know if there's going to be end to this problem. I don't think it will. I think these problems fade as generations shift and new problems arise. That's my feeling about this whole vaccine thing. But in a nutshell, what would you say, advise people, particularly parents who are struggling to find a pediatric practice that will take them on, number one, and the education system, and then the medical folks who have had a reaction to vaccine and now can potentially lose their jobs? Is there something that you've noticed that works better for them in terms of preparing their body to receive the vaccine? Or
yeah, there's all kinds of really cool protocols out there. Like Dr. Blaylock, has a vaccine protocol where you do like vitamin C, and you do vitamin C drinks, C-rich drinks like green smoothies. You can do like liver support, cod liver oil. Some people can go get IV vitamins, like older people can go get IV vitamins, like we have, there's these medical cool IV places now. You can get Myers packs, has all these different vitamin packs. Supporting your liver, supporting the antioxidants, drinking lots of water before and after, avoiding Tylenol, for instance. Tylenol is I just don't even have it in my house anymore. There's just too many bad things about it. So for those people who want, there's definitely, and I know you have your own protocols, right? That you can get.
I'm very particular about sleep before a vaccination, because there are studies that show if you have poor sleep and you try to get vaccinated, you don't have a good response, or you can actually fall sick. So,
or if you're under stress or not. Yeah, stress impacts it. I've seen that. And
I ask them to do melatonin before the vaccine, so that they can actually get some sleep, like a week before the vaccine. Just really schedule your vaccine. Don't walk into a doctor's office and say, oh, you're going to give me a vaccine? Okay, let's take it. Prepare, plan, go for it like it's a surgery. And that's the way I would advise my patients.
I would definitely, for parents who have little children who have any autoimmune disease in the family or neurologic things in the family to consider really finding a doctor that goes slower, which is hard to find. And you really have to like talk to mothers and different mothers groups, say, hey, who do you know? And honestly, to protect those doctors, at this point, I'm out there, like whatever, like I am here on a mission to protect my children and their rights to live a normal life. But there's a lot of doctors willing to tolerate unvaccinated people, but you have to make sure you don't like make a big deal about it when you call the office. You talk to mothers, and then you discreetly talk to the doctor about it with respect and say, hey, I have these concerns about the vaccines, and hopefully they'll honor that. But sometimes you have to go through a bunch of doctors, and it's becoming harder. 5 years ago, it was easier, but since in the last 5 years, they have it's
well,
just
that's
so
the likelihood of a physician that'll go away if they support this. And, this is democracy at its best.
Well, that's why, unfortunately, there are, and again, I think most doctors don't think of it like it's the money, but, I know enough doctors that, quite frankly, they run their own business. When they did vaccinate, there was a clinic who the doctor said, listen, she sent out, she was totally innocent when she's doing it. It's like, I'm going to have to close my doors unless more of you vaccinate. So she's like, it's costing me too much money. And if you want me to stay in business, then I'm going to have to demand 100% vaccination rate because I'm just not getting enough money in return to be able to stay open. So she literally was creating a mandate for her office so she could afford to stay open.
Yeah,
that's a real problem if you're mandating vaccines in your office for financial reasons. That's not even, how is that even remotely related?
More than financial reasons, it's like she's not going to be able to practice medicine, which is her livelihood. Because I remember the first year I was open, I bought flu vaccines based on how many 65 and above I had. It cost me $900. I think I got the multi-vial. And literally, I dumped majority because within a certain number of days, you have to use the whole vial. And people would not, they would go to CVS and get it and everywhere. So I just stopped having vaccines. Patients don't realize that. That's $1,000 for a small practice like me is huge. It's a huge amount.
Yeah, there's no doubt, but for pediatricians, even worse because they really don't get their reimbursement primarily comes from the vaccines. Yeah. It simply does. And they can say all they want to. It's not about the money. When you're owned by a corporation, you might not realize it's what it is. But any pediatrician that owns their own practice, they know how critical that the vaccine market is for their bottom line. It just simply is. It adds up. It's a make or break. But having a vaccine policy based upon your ability to keep a practice open is absolutely I think against the Hippocratic Oath, quite frankly. So you pretty much have to find concierge type practices that are willing to take you and sort of direct primary care. But even I'm part of direct primary care programs, like groups out there, and they won't take you either because they're terrified of you. Suddenly and the ironic thing is that most adults are less vaccinated than a 9-month-old baby. And
That is true. When I think of the last time I had a vaccination, it's like almost I can't even remember it.
Right. It's like we have fewer vaccines than a 9-month-old, but yet are we a danger to society? Are we walking around like, oh my gosh, you've got cooties, No, but that's part of that mob mentality kind of thing. But I think, the other thing is I think it's important for parents to start writing legislators to say, listen, you've got to protect our rights. Ultimately, you will have a better, more robust vaccine schedule if you gain our trust. Mm-hmm. And if we have doctors discussing risks and benefits and respecting our desires to take care of our children, because these are our children. These children do not belong to the government. But there is a scary trend that people think it's okay that the government owns our children. But my child is my child, and I'm ultimately responsible for that child. I want the right to take care of my child until they're old enough to make decisions for themselves, so they can drive their own car and have their own job and buy their own food, and then they can do whatever they want. So our legislators, we need to write our legislators say, under any circumstance, we're going to allow support mandates. We need to educate our pastors and our teachers. Say, do you know what? It's not as one size fits all kind of thing. This is a lot more nuanced than what is presented in the media. The 70% of media revenue comes from pharma. So we honestly, in my perfect world, we get rid of the influence of pharma on media advertising and reporting. Not just advertising, but they actually put it into the reporting as if it's fact and it's absolutely advertisement in their news programs. we need to get rid of the corrupt part of lobbying. Lobbying is important because legislators need to know what's important, but they should not be making money or having policies like being made in a corrupt fashion in DC. And so we, on our legislator level, the teachers level, and the doctors, honestly, I don't know how to undo the anger that has been built in our medical society, but I honestly can't comprehend how doctors have so much anger. We're in such a blessed position, but how somehow when we are here to serve the patient's needs for their best interest, suddenly the idea, because I remember being trained, in the olden days is a very paternalistic situation where they told the patients this is what it is. Now it's a new, of course I trained 20 years ago, it's a whole new thing where you really include the patient in with a discussion. And now suddenly again, nope, you don't have a voice, you need to be quiet or you get out. It's like we have reverted back to this old paternalistic society. So honestly, most of my parents that are here in my practice, they're like, well, I was want to do more, but when my pediatrician shut me down, I was like, I'd be danged if I'm going to do more. So the pediatrician, by desire to improve vaccination rates, they actually lessen it, the increased distrust among people, and they can get way more vaccines if they would just actually have a discussion with the parents and listen. Not just like, I know more than you, period. Listen, because honestly, most of you pediatricians and family doctors don't know more than a lot of these parents. Honestly, I've learned so much from the parents because they have researched this topic so deeply, and I had not. I researched car seats more than I researched vaccines, and I was a family doctor.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have to, because it's settled science, right? So we need to get off of our high horse as physicians and start listening to patients, and also each other, like this whole idea again that we can't trust our own eyes and our own hands. Science, the very foundation of science is the beginning is anecdote, quite frankly. You look for anecdote, and then you look for patterns of that. And then I go, well, patterns of that, all right, what is this then? And then it builds on that. And then you get studies, but that comes from asking questions and conversations, debates. I still argue that in this society where we're not supposed to study religion or politics, that we should be discussing religion and politics and understand that we still, we still indeed have more in common than we don't have in common. And that if we meet in the middle, we'll learn so much more about someone else's way of thinking. And that, okay, well, then maybe some of the anti-vaccine people might be willing to say, well, I guess it makes sense in this situation for this disease process to maybe get this vaccine. And this pro-vaccine person's like, oh, well, yeah, okay, so you had all these things. Instead of saying, oh, it's just coincidence, stop with this, it's like an epidemic of coincidences. Stop with that. Get that out. Listen to the parent. They may be right or they may be wrong, but it's not our job to sit there and like, my job, I am trained to see murderers. We're trained in medical school. You have to see murderers. If you see the most worst guy, you still have to provide medical care to that patient. Horrible criminals. You still have to give medical care to that patient and eliminate your emotional connection to that crime that person committed, right?
Absolutely.
You remember learning that? Why are parents of children
I actually go to the jail system.
There you go.
Yeah. And I see child molesters. I don't want to know what they did, how they got themselves into jail. My job is to just look at their symptoms and truly help them. That's it.
Right. So why do parents get treated differently than criminals?
Yeah, I know. This is a conversation we could have for days on end, because I don't think we will find a solution, because we are human beings. If you look at the problems in the world, it's because we're not willing to see each other's point of view. Really, we're not willing to see it. But I think the bottom line is you have to make a choice for your child and for yourself. And whatever it takes to make the right choice, because you know your child better. The doctor, I always say this to my patients, as doctors, we know the disease better. We know to some degree, right now, we don't know any of the drugs. I mean, I think when I graduated, medical science evolved like maybe once in 10 years. If I updated myself, I was good. Now, every 90 days, I have to update myself. So what's happening is we're all niching down. I don't know how you're a family practitioner. I could never be one, because that's so much to learn. There's so much to know. But even in your family practice, I think you'll find that certain things you're more comfortable with.
Right.
I've had to niche down, and this is what I'm known for, because I just can't be known. I just can't be good at all of those things because there's so much happening in science. So I think that's very important for physicians to know that we don't know. We don't have the answers for everything. And the answers we have are maybe right today and not right tomorrow. Everything is in a moment. And I feel like listening should begin with the physician.
Right.
And I feel that's what, if we're not willing to listen, it's like, don't talk to me about anything against vaccines because I'm not about to listen to that. It's a very difficult stand to take for everyone, for yourself.
The more I realize there is to learn.
There's so much to learn. There's so much to learn, and there's so much evolving. And somebody's going to teach you a new lesson that you never knew, even after. I remember I went to medical school when I was 17. That's what happens in India. We don't have the pre-med. We go directly from high school to medical school, which I think is absolutely crazy. You don't have the maturity, don't have anything. When medicine finally clicked, so I could potentially practice, like have the license to kill at the age of 22, right? And when medicine actually clicked in my head, I was 42. That's how long it took for the realization biochemistry and physiology and anatomy is what I needed to master. The pathophysiology and pharmacology is how I practiced. But if I didn't have the mastery of physiology, biochemistry, and anatomy, all my pharmacology was wrong.
Right.
And I think that's very important for most physicians to understand. And I think patients, you just have to advocate for yourself. You really have to advocate for yourself, and
be strong, and know they're up against a lot. They're up against big egos, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So something that you are willing to do for listeners is you do like vaccine consultations, correct? And
the goal is not to tell people not to get vaccines. It's just to give more information on.
If they want to know a little more about the vaccine.
Yes.
Like if they have a doubt in their head, like you said, I didn't connect my daughter's symptoms to the vaccine. But sometimes moms have it, but the pediatrician is not willing to even listen to that. A person like you might be able to help them see the light in how this has evolved. Is it really from a vaccine or is it something else? So that's a great consultation. That's actually a very powerful gift that you can give. How do people reach you, and how do they get to do this consultation with you?
My website is probably the easiest. Is BentonIntegrative.com. That's BENTON, BentonIntegrative.com. It's got the telephone number on there. It's got an email contact form. It's got all of our information. I am in North Carolina. I actually am licensed now in a few other states because I also do telemedicine. So I'm licensed actually in Ohio and Florida. And honestly, I've forgotten the other ones.
Are you licensed?
They're adding licenses. I did this because of the coronavirus thing, because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Honestly, our business got even busier. So it was the opposite of what I expected, which is great. It's a blessing. But they can call and ask for like a phone consult. And, I am on Facebook. I have Cammy Benton. It's like a little medical cartoon, Cammy Benton, and CAMMY Benton. And I post a lot of articles on there as well. But like for actual consultation, and normally we charge $360 for an hour. And so we'll offer it like $199 for your listeners.
Wow. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah.
Or 60-minute consult. And I'll give, mostly, I'll assess sort of like, what is your story? And, I'll answer questions about vaccines and stuff. But also I'll give some good reading ideas, because there's a book called A Tale of Two Sides that I love a lot, that it does really an amazing job of discussing the risk of disease, the risk of death and disability versus the vaccine, and discusses some of the politics and the cognitive dissonance of doctors behind the scenes, and how hard it is for a doctor to honestly go against the grain. What goes into it for them, and why so many doctors out there don't say anything. And a lot of it's just pressure, honestly, peer pressure. And it's a beautifully written book. So, I give some book recommendations and even some detox ideas before and after for if you do decide to get vaccinated and when. So I get that information on there.
Awesome. This has been an interesting conversation. I've never done this topic, and because, a lot of what I deal with is adult diseases. But I think with the COVID-19, I can see how the world is divided. I think we all get to see it. And I think we are divided 50-50 on every issue today in the world. And how do you learn to listen, and how do you learn to make decisions? I think is going to become very important as the future evolves. So thank you so much for the information. I think this was very interesting, and hope people who listen to it also walk away with some information that's useful.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I love to talk about it. So
yes.
I'm in my mission. So.
And that's with a lot of information. And I really think you put it in a very, these are facts. These are things that have happened in your life. This is how you connected the dots, and now you are able to empathize with other people. And that's the word that's missing. I think empathy is missing today in medicine, and compassion is going to be missing very soon. And I think that's frightening. So hopefully we'll learn to listen to each other and also speak up. Yep.
Yes, be brave. Now is not the time to hide. We have to be brave, because if we're too silent and then we lose our opportunity, it's hard to undo. It's hard to undo decisions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Have a wonderful day and happy holiday, everyone.